Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Mounting concerns over border security and rising geopolitical tensions prompted Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk during a visit to the border with Belarus to say, "We are mobilising Europe to treat this border as a common duty, and we have further confirmation that both Shield East and the protection of the border against illegal crossings, that this is a common European duty. Should this become a priority investment for the European Union?" Well, to discuss that is Shea, former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO, to discuss the strategic importance of Shield East. Welcome, sir, to TVP World, and thank you for taking the time. So tell us about Shield East. What is it comprised of and what is its aim?
Well, there are two aspects here, of course. First of all, it's protecting the borders of the EU, particularly Poland, against what you just described, illegal migrants. We've had in the past, as Poland well knows, the attempt by the Lukashenko regime in Belarus to forcibly push the migrants over the border into Poland to weaponize them. And at that time, of course, Poland deployed additional forces, particularly military forces on the border, but also had the assistance of the European Union and the EU's border force. So clearly that's an ever-present danger that there could be a repetition of those kind of tactics, which NATO often refers to as hybrid warfare. But the other aspect, I think, which Prime Minister Tusk is also focusing on, of course, is given the growing threat to NATO, to Poland from Russia, to what extent we need to look at more border fortifications in the east. NATO, of course, has forces in Poland, in the Baltic states, so Poland is protected, particularly also with US forces in Poland. But it was very interesting just a couple of days ago that Prime Minister Tusk and other NATO governments, for example, in the Baltic states and Finland, announced that they might they will take their countries out of the anti-personnel landmine convention, the Ottawa Convention, so that they have more freedom to put landmines on the border and look at other kind of enhanced forms of defense. So there's the hybrid warfare one, but there is, of course, also the classical military one that has to be looked at as well.
Right, so let's focus on the military aspect for a second there. What do you think Prime Minister Tusk meant in practical terms when he said that this was a shared responsibility of the EU?
Well, the EU just a couple of days ago had a big meeting and decided to allocate over the next 5 years up to 800 billion euros for defence programmes and eased its fiscal rules to allow more deficit spending, so that the EU as an entity can co-finance defence programmes. And there's an initial fund called SAFE of 150 billion euros, which is going to be available. So that means a lot more money is going to be available precisely to improve EU defences. Much of that, of course, is going to go into military production, but there is also a case for looking to what extent that money can also be used for things like air defence, anti-drone defence, better drone protection on borders, better sort of quick reaction aircraft capabilities along borders, and better equipment and better training, both for border guards and for those military forces deployed on borders, particularly to anticipate incidents, for example, enhanced satellite surveillance of borders and more sensors as well. So certainly the money is going to be available. The key thing now for the EU is to develop the programs and move quickly so that investment can take place.
Now, there has been a concern amongst many EU states in the past that to be too aggressive, I suppose, in its response might be a provocation to Russia, and they've shied away from taking such steps. Do you think a similar attitude applies today in terms of putting European equipment on the border of Poland and other countries on the eastern flank?
I think the attitudes have been changing quickly here. You're absolutely right. When Ursula von der Leyen the president of the EU Commission described this program as Rearm Europe, Rearm EU. Certain countries, particularly Italy, Spain, didn't like that. They thought maybe it sounded a bit too militaristic. And of course, the EU, as we know, has always defined itself as a great peace project. But if you want peace, you have to prepare for war. And I think the great majority of the EU countries, including my own country, the UK, of course, which is unfortunately no longer in the EU, do now realise that there is a higher level of risk and danger. The world has changed, whether we like it or not. Russia is a threat. Of course, with the Trump administration, we don't know just how much we can continue to depend on the United States in the future. And Europe has to take more of its defence into its own hands. And I think that attitude change is reflected in your neighbour Germany. It would have been unthinkable a few years ago that Germany would reach the NATO target of 2% of defence spending of GDP, or would now agree to change its debt rules to allow much more spending on defence and the modernisation of the Bundeswehr. So I think it's not just in Central and Eastern Europe where countries like Poland have had the sort of the spirit of defence for a long time, but I think across Europe now there is this awareness that Europe has to really come out of its complacency and do more for its defence. So most certainly, and the fact that the money is now there and the plans to ramp up production are there now. And NATO, of course, also has been conducting major exercises in Central and Eastern Europe to make sure that it's also ready to defend itself. I think there's lots of examples of the fact that what a former German chancellor called the Zeitenwende, the change of the times, doesn't apply just to Germany, but to the EU as a whole.
Now, there seem to be a number of layers on EU defence. You just mentioned NATO, and I want to talk about that in a second. And a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned SAFE, the availability of funding for military production in Europe. But, you know, SAFE is far from the first. We have PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation Defence Cooperation between EU member states from 2017. We have the European Defence Fund. Why did we need SAFE? I mean, surely these earlier agreements and plans should have been able to cover this, shouldn't they?
Well, a very, very worthy question. But let me answer that by saying that what we had before with things like PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation, and the European Defence Fund were much smaller packets of money. The European Defence Fund was only 8 billion, and they were focused mainly on sort of capability development, research and development, which of course is necessary in defence, but they weren't focused on mass production. They didn't involve big companies reopening production lines, buying up chemicals, bringing their supply chains back home, and being in a position to mass produce tanks and armoured personnel vehicles or air defence systems. What we have now is massively greater. I mentioned 150 billion initially for joint investment, the 800 billion overall figure. And if you think that just a couple of years ago, the European defence industry strategy had a budget of just 1.5 billion, and now it's gone up to 150 billion, you could see where the step change has really taken place. So the answer to your question, I believe, is that we've gone from a focus on sort of research and development and getting countries to come up with joint sort of ideas for defence, now to a European-wide industrial strategy to re-equip our defence industries and really to get them producing again. But you're right to the extent that you cannot defend yourself, unfortunately, with 100 euro notes. You can only defend yourself with hard capabilities. So that finance has to be quickly turned into capabilities, and of course on budget, on time, and quality equipment. We can't afford too many major failures here with big cost overruns and poor equipment being delivered years behind schedule.
Understood. Thank you for laying that out for us. Now, coming to the overlap between NATO and the EU in this particular issue, there is some uncertainty over President Trump's attitude towards membership of NATO. You know, we have this response by the European Union. How do you see those two initiatives coming together and working effectively in Ukraine, Poland, and so on?
Well, certainly it was encouraging when the EU had its summit back on March the 6th, the big one which decided on these new financial frameworks for defence production. It was encouraging that the EU said that they are going to prioritise exactly the capabilities that NATO is prioritising. So there won't be, if you like, a NATO set of capabilities and then a completely different EU set, which would be incoherent. So the EU is putting the emphasis on artificial intelligence, ballistic and air missile defense, military mobility, transport capabilities, adequate stocks of munitions, just the kind of things that NATO has identified from its recent exercises as being the capability gaps that it needs to address. So EU money is going into NATO targets, which I think is the good thing. The other thing, of course, is what I mentioned a moment ago, which is hybrid war, the thing that I dealt with as a NATO official. And that is the area of sort of disinformation campaigns and cyber attacks and sabotage operations carried out by Russia. Poland, of course, has had its share of these negative experiences. And here again, the EU and NATO can cooperate very well with their joint advantages in this area in terms of information and intelligence sharing, getting industry, which the EU is very good at, involved in upgrading our common defences. I think the third area is that the United States has said that it's not going to yet at least engage in a peacekeeping or peace implementation force in Ukraine. And so the UK and France jointly have decided to form a coalition of the willing, where you have some EU countries, NATO countries, but also non-EU countries. I mentioned the UK, Canada, Turkey, Australia and New Zealand are participating in these meetings. In other words, not being bound by institutional rigidities, but coming together in a joint willingness to contribute and to do the planning for this future force. And I think this is significant because it shows a new flexibility. If people want to work together, we won't let institutions get in the way. We need all contributions. But I think also this will help to bring NATO, if you think of the UK being in NATO now but not in the EU, it will also bring the UK and the EU, NATO and the EU in general closer together. And of course for Poland, this is very important because the stronger Ukraine is, the more robust the Ukrainian army is. It's the best force at the moment in terms of standing up to Russia with the best combat experience. Then, of course, the burden on the Polish border, which we began our conversation talking about, will be significantly reduced.
Understood. Mr. Shea, unfortunately, we're going to have to end our conversation at this point, but thank you so much for laying out this analysis for our audience. Have a good day, sir.
And to you too, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's all from us on World Talks on TVP World. Goodbye.